Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 49th of the Tax Stories podcast episodes. Today I have my guest is Susi Baerentzen. Did I pronounce it right, Susi?
Yes, that was very excellent.
Thank you, thank you. Susi, welcome to the show. Susi is a tax law and human rights researcher from Denmark. She holds a PhD in international tax law and economics. She recently published her book on the effectiveness of general anti-avoidance rules. Here is the book, Susie. So I've uh, quite uh, well into the book as well. We will
Mhm.
talk about that as well. And Susie has worked for 5 years for one of the big four companies, and now is also a Nordic tax manager at a large multinational company. She's lecturing at Vienna and Copenhagen universities. Anything else important you would like to mention about yourself?
No, that's more or less sums it up. So at the moment, I'm the Nordic head of tax at a company, and
Hmm.
on the sidelines as a researcher, I'm also finalizing my habilitation on taxpayers' rights. So that's more or less what I spend my time on.
Okay, so it broadens the scope of the topics we could talk about today. So,
Absolutely.
but before that, on a personal note, I saw that you have mountains on your LinkedIn profile. Uh, uh, I've never done hiking. When I think of it, a Depeche Mode song, "Enjoy the Silence," comes to my mind. Is hiking your hideaway from everything else?
No, extreme triathlon is my hideaway. So the
Oh,
mountains you're seeing are from. So I compete in the World Series of extreme triathlon. So it's basically like Ironman. It's just usually a little bit longer, and then the extreme part is the fact that everything takes place in the mountains. So a lot of climbing, a lot of descending, a lot of really bad weather that comes with the territory.
wow, wow. How long is it approximately, just to
Well,
capture?
it's you swim just short of 4 kilometers. Because of everything being in the mountains, it's a very long day compared to a traditional Ironman in the city. So we usually start very early in the morning at 5 o'clock. So we start in the dark. We swim in the dark
Mm.
somewhere really cold. And then you get on your bike and ride somewhere between 180 and 205 kilometers in the mountains.
Wow.
And then you finish that off with a marathon at the end, also in the mountains. So for me, a day like that usually takes around somewhere between 17 and 19 hours. So yeah, it's a very long day.
Wow, that's impressive. How did you come to such hobby?
Well, I got really tired of. I only did one traditional Ironman in Copenhagen many years ago, and I quickly got really tired of all the middle-aged men, tax partners in Lycra, who has to do an Ironman to put it on their resumes and to get clients, and that's all very cool. But then they sit back on the couch. So I had enough of those, and then I discovered extreme triathlon. So it's in really rough nature, which also means that they're only allowed to have 200 competitors roughly per race because of safety.
Mm.
So a very small group. Everybody is completely insane, uh, obviously. So that's very nice people. It's not at all about the glory. It's just about the rough nature and this insane challenge. So that's my happy place.
Mm. So it's the process you enjoy of doing
Yeah,
this. Yeah.
it's this extreme endurance that yeah, you really have to be incredibly stubborn to do it. It's physical, but it's also very much mental, that you have to be able to handle extreme pressure and not to crack.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, it's a lot like tax law, just just in nature, you know.
Is it dangerous as well?
Yeah, I mean, for these races, you have to have a support team with you. So you need a car accompanying you at all times. A little bit like the race cars in the Tour de France, for example. So it is very dangerous, yes, and it is not for everybody, obviously,
Mm.
because it takes a toll on the body
Mm.
and on the mind. So, but they take really good care of us. So.
Wow. How do you prepare for that? So do you have practice every second day?
Every day basically, 1 day a week off, and then I'm really boring. So
Wow. Wow.
mostly just taxlon and extreme triathlon. So
So
yeah.
to inspire the other listeners, how what is the routine of the day? When do you find time for practicing this?
Well, when I can get away with it, I like to train in the mornings. So I like to get up at very early, 4 or 5, and do training before I go to the office. And then I have to, because I have a lot of travel days. So when I'm traveling, I bring my running gear, and then I plan to have my run trainings there. And of course, swimming and biking is a little bit different. I travel a lot with my bike as well.
Mm.
So
Wow.
it's a good way to also to interact with peers and clients. There are quite a few people in tax law who are biking and running, especially. So I think there are quite a few tax people who've been out racing with me on my bike, which is, I really like that. So
Mm.
I do try to bring it when I can.
Right. The only tax person I know doing triathlon, not such extreme, is in Switzerland. So
Yeah.
I can put you through it for
Sounds good.
for a company. Okay, okay, great. Wow, this is impressive stuff. I think people will find truly inspiring this, and will find some time to do some more exercise, even if it's not for Ironman purposes. But on another topic, as a linguistics officer trainee in the Arabic language, you also learned the history and politics of the Middle East. And
Yeah.
with all the military conflicts now in Israel and also not far away in Ukraine, what's your impression where the world is moving to? And do you have some comments on that?
Yeah, so coming from a military background, and before that I was with the Red Cross. So I actually became a lawyer because I wanted to be a lawyer in the army. So a judge advocate general. That was my plan since ninth grade.
Mm.
So I did the whole studied a year in France in Strasbourg and learned human rights and EU law on a very very high level. Worked there at the institutions, and I then moved to the Red Cross and worked there for a few years in the Middle East, in Balkan, working with the rules of war basically. And then I switched to the army actually while I was still in law school. So I was a terrible law student. I did all things I wasn't supposed to do. Um, but it was a very unique experience. And when I was in the army, I was trained by Israeli soldiers as well. We had a lot of collaborations around the world. I also, before that in my career, when I was in the Middle East with the Red Cross and Red Crescent movements, I was in Jordan for a long time, working with the refugee camps, uh, which back then and still holds a lot of Palestinian refugees. So I worked really closely with both the Palestinian, the Syrian, and the Jordanian Red Crescent movement, and also with the Israeli Magen David Adom. So I probably have a very, let's say, a very broad and very unique perspective on everything that's going on. Obviously, both from a humanitarian point of view and as a soldier. And well, to me, no matter what conflict we're talking about, no matter what side we're looking at, the most devastating thing is the loss of all the civilians. And unfortunately, that hasn't changed at all since I worked in that business. I'm still part of the reserve, so if the situation becomes dangerous enough that Denmark feels threatened, then I will no longer be a tax lawyer. That's not by obligation, that's by choice, because once a soldier, always a soldier. So that's perhaps a little bit unique for me. And also, obviously, in recent years, I mean, the new members of NATO are neighbors of Denmark, and let's say we feel the conflict in Ukraine very closely, in the sense that, well, on a regular basis, we have Russian fighter jets flying over Copenhagen. We have Russian submarines in the waters around the Danish coasts. And we have a very, very close connection to the Baltic countries, historically speaking. That's something we've prioritized, and we're really happy about that. So, of course, that also means that while the conflict is not in our backyard, it is in Sweden's backyard, and it is in Finland's backyard, and it is in the backyard of the Baltics. So it's only 1 degree of separation. So we feel that very closely. And for that conflict, I speak the wrong language. But now, as the world is looking at the moment, yes, I read the news differently. Of course I do. And when I drink my morning coffee, I I don't really read the Danish news. I read the Arabic news. I read Al Jazeera. Yeah, try to keep up with what is happening.
Yeah, but I understand it's a very difficult topic for you to discuss. But do you see anything resolving soon, or is it like for many years to come?
I wish I could say that, but speaking from experience, no. I think if there's one thing which is a general tendency in the world at the moment, no matter what conflict we're looking at, is that every step forward we take 2 steps back. So there are some very extreme powers at play. That's basically everywhere, and that has a lot of bad influences. A lot of people with too much power and too much desire for more power. And again, no matter what conflict we're looking at, I think the amount of civilian losses we're seeing at the moment is extraordinarily high.
Yeah. Okay, let's switch topics. Tell me about your brother Jesper. You wrote in the book that he was your inspiration to learn. So
That's
how's that?
true. I dedicated my PhD to my brother. He basically raised me. He's much older than me. He's 17 years older than me. And as a kid growing up, he was he was this badass mechanic on the very large cargo ships. He was working for Maersk. So he would sail all over the world, and he never grasped the concept of different time zones. So he would call at all hours a day. And he had no, well, he raised me in many ways, and he had no idea what he was doing, basically. He never raised me as a girl. He, I think he's partly to blame for my desire to become a lawyer in the army, because we would watch army shows together. We would we would go on extreme hikes. We would go on extremely long bike rides together, even when I was small. And he was a very good influence because he forgot to teach me how to do girly stuff. He forgot to teach me how to be a nice girl and a good housewife. So when I grew up, when I was a kid, I didn't want to become a princess or something like that. I wanted to be an Air Force pilot. So I would run around and ride my little tripod bike for years, basically, because I saw on television that you had to be really strong and really fast to become an Air Force pilot. And at some point, he had to break my heart, the poor guy, and tell me that actually they didn't even allow women to try for the test outs for becoming an Air Force pilot. That is, and I was very small, but I still remember how confused I was about that. Him telling me that there was something that I couldn't do because I was a girl. I thought that was incredibly stupid. I still think it is. Luckily now you can actually become an Air Force pilot as a woman in Denmark.
Is that how you become the human rights expert?
I think the human rights sort of snuck in with the international humanitarian law and the army perspective. So I blame my time in Strasbourg for that. That was absolutely fantastic to study there and be so close to the European Court of Human Rights. So that's definitely where that comes from. And of course, if you work seriously with the rules of war, you also have to be quite specialized in human rights because there is a common platform there.
Writing the book actually takes quite a lot of time, of course. What's your routine of writing the book?
Well, my PhD, when I did it, I was also working at PwC, so long days. And basically, when I really have to write something seriously, and I still do that, I go to Amsterdam and I hide at the IBFD. So I sit in their library, and then I have all the books, and I have super bright people around me who I can ask about anything, and that's really my tax law Narnia.
Yeah, I've been to IBFD premises. They're really comfortable.
Very comfortable.
And at some point you switched from Big Four to academia. So what was your sort of vision behind that?
Well, so after my PhD, I won this 2-year grant to just focus on tax law and human rights, which was really a privilege to be able to try that, how that felt full time. I like that a lot as well, but at least at the time, being a full-time academic was nice to try it out, but I felt I wasn't quite done with learning from practice, which is why I switched to being in-house, basically. So I'm a terrible tax consultant, because as a tax consultant you have to be very good at walking in line, and walk like a dog and quack like a dog, and I'm not. I'm good at many things, but I'm horrible at making slideshows and even worse at walking in line. So
What do you mean by working line?
walking in line, well, basically, if you work at a Big Four corporation or a big law firm for that matter, there's a certain mold that you have to fit into. And, well, I like doing extreme triathlons. I used to be in the army. I don't really tick the boxes. So I think differently. I do things differently. I see authority differently. So that's I absolutely loved a lot of the work. I was super privileged to have really exciting tasks, and my colleagues were really bright people, very nice people. So it was never really about that. But yeah, when you've done a certain amount of tasks on the same topic, it just, yeah,
So
it gets a little bit.
basically working in-house, you have more freedom, so you feel more.
I think the difference, one thing I really loved about being at a big four company, and I was in the international tax department, so a lot of my clients were big multinationals. And what I really liked about those tasks was being so close to the head of tax or the head of finance, whoever we were working for, and actually being very close to the business. Um, so that was why I went in-house, because I thought that would be a nice way to make tax law very real.
Mm.
And I missed that. And I'm definitely getting my money's worth. That's and it is, I mean, one of the favorite parts of my job is going to the, well, to the production sites and to talk to the people who actually run the business. That's also a really big part of the job when you're managing the taxes, to make sure that, because it's easy to get information into the tax department and then we describe it and pass it on, and we don't necessarily have any idea what we're talking about because we're basically a back office function. So it's important to go and talk to the people who are actually getting their hands dirty, and who are actually running the business. Because if you have a tax audit or if you want to be compliant, well, then you actually also need to know how your business work. And I love that
But
part of it.
and speaking of being an in-house at large multinational, do you see some sort of development if we look at the past, present, and future of being an in-house? How has the role evolved?
That's a very good question. I think maybe 10 years ago, everybody was focused on effective tax rates. Now the game is much more complicated. You have to know a lot more. And it's not just enough that you have excellent advisors who tell you everything. You always have to be one step ahead, and have to think very specifically, even if you have an old school production facility. So you may not, on the surface at least, get hit by a lot of the new initiatives and the new ways to change the international taxation system. But I think very often when you then scratch the surface, you realize, well, it still hits you in some way or the other. Because if the company is big enough, well, then it's also complex enough that this will become your problem at some point. So one thing I really enjoy is we have these networks among us in Denmark, for example. So those of us who are head of tax at the larger companies in Denmark, we use each other a lot. We use each other's experience a lot, and that's really, really valuable.
Mm. And how do you see the future role of the in-house? Do you do you have any predictions?
I think that the in-house tax departments are only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think one area where going forward we'll really see an increase is in terms of, well, the in-house people handling the disputes, basically. So everything is becoming more international and cross-border, and figuring out, I mean, 10 years ago, if you had a transfer pricing audit and you speak to the head of accounting and they would say, well, it doesn't really matter for the books, because then you pay more tax in one country and then you just pay less tax in another country, and we do some kind of mutual agreement procedure. Today, it's a whole different game. because there's much more discussion about the allocation of taxing rights. It's much more complicated. And we also have new tools in terms of alternative dispute resolution. We have arbitration coming in. And I think that, at least especially from a Danish perspective, that is a little bit novel to us. So I think in 10 years, every multinational will need a head of dispute resolution as well as a head of tax.
Is somehow technology or AI already helping your daily tasks?
In some ways, I think perhaps that's more for the, let's say, more technological heavy companies. For me, it's a little bit, I see the potential. I also think it's a little bit the emperor's new clothes. So let's take Pillar 2 as an example. I've seen many, many wonderful proposals from all big four companies, all the big advisory firms, and they always have some kind of wonderful solution. Not that I've been offered it in my role as in-house, but I just observe that they're all working on their individual toys to to map all of your activities and to comply with Pillar 2. And every time I see those toys, I think it is a little bit the emperor's new clothes. It has potential, sure, but basically what you've built is some kind of SAP system with a dashboard. And kudos to them for making money on that. I'm wildly impressed by how people can manage to produce large sales off of it. But I think what it really speaks to is not just the creativity of the advisory firms, but also the level of complexity that we're dealing with today, and the fact that I think very few people really fully grasp all of the new rules which we're being hit by.
I also used some technology while preparing for this interview, and I asked ChatGPT to select a question specifically for you, Susie, and specifically for Tax Stories podcast.
Wow.
And I selected the one question I like the most. How do you think tax professionals can better engage with the public to demystify taxation and promote better understanding?
Oh, that's a very good question. So the last 2 years, something I've spent a lot of time on is actually being in the newspapers as a so-called tax expert. So whenever there's a big tax case from the Danish Supreme Court or the European Court of Justice, there's actually a lot of interest from the media. And I know to a lot of tax experts that can be annoying, but I actually think it's a very good sign that, first of all, the public is interested. I think if the public hadn't been so interested following the financial crisis, well, we wouldn't have had any of the international overhauls we've had of our tax systems. And I also think it is, at least in my experience, the journalists I speak to, I am wildly fascinated about how excellent they are at understanding the rules and also describing and telling it in a way that everybody can understand. So that's something I think is really important. And I would like to encourage all of my fellow peers, if a journalist call, maybe don't be so afraid to say something wrong or to say something that, of course, we all work at corporations and we have to be careful about what hats we're wearing. But at the end of the day, well, a lot of it boils down to simple interpretation of rules. And I think that's really important to participate in.
Good advice. Well, let's talk about your book. Would you do a sales pitch of your book?
Yes, absolutely. So It is my PhD. It's been rewritten and changed a little bit, also to better, better suit the needs of people working in practice. So it has a very nice overview of, if you're focusing on general anti-avoidance rules, how they came to exist and what are the strengths and what are the pitfalls, and also a very nice overview of the relevant case law. So basically a very good starting point, no matter if we're looking at a European or global tax perspective, to figure out where to look further for whatever you can use to support your case.
How do you come to this topic, and what were your revelations during the research?
Well, when I started the thoughts for my PhD, I was in my first tax job. I was working for the Minister of Taxation in Denmark. In Denmark, tax is such a tough topic that we don't just leave it up to the Minister of Finance. We have a specific ministry for it. So I was working there, basically writing the tax legislation and supporting the minister along with a lot of excellent colleagues. So I was and at the time, Denmark did not have a general anti-abuse provision, but we had started the discussions as to whether or not we should get one. And of course, this was 2013, 14. So yeah, we were just about to get the anti-tax avoidance directive and the principal purposes test, and the Danish beneficial ownership cases went before the European Court of Justice a few years later. So a lot of exciting things going on, and a lot of debates also in Denmark about how to proceed with these rules. And for me, it was really fascinating to have this new weapon that we weren't used to having. And I started wondering whether or not it was actually a good idea. So that was where the interest started. And by coincidence, I got to speak to a very renowned Danish professor. And I asked him and said, what is your view on this? Do you think it's a good idea? Does it work like it's supposed to? And he encouraged me to write a PhD on it. And because I was working at the ministry and I was working with drafting the tax legislation, if you've ever done that, you'll know that nothing gets passed unless it has some nice economic consequences. So I was very used to working closely with the economists and working with the economic aspect as well of tax law. So I thought, in order to properly assess, well, are the rules actually a good idea, I had to look at it both from a legal and economic perspective. And then I, of course, realized how little I knew about economics. And I was lucky that I got to team up with some very excellent tax economists. So I could not have done this project without them. So yeah, that has really been a blessing.
I just returned a couple of weeks ago from IFA Congress in Cancun, and there was I remember there was a nice slide in one of the presentations that people in tax now have to master so many concepts regarding this economic substance, this principal purpose test, beneficial ownership, general GAAR, SAR, CFC. How businesses can comply with all those principles? So
It's actually a good question, and it was something I also tried to focus on in my PhD. Also learning from the very excellent economists I work with, because I think the Danish beneficial ownership cases are probably the best example. When they came out and from the European Court of Justice, and the court handed us this list of what was considered abusive structures and abusive business. I think all the tax lawyers were pretty confused, and we pulled our hair and said, "Oh no, this is not from the previous case law. Where did they get this? And then I spoke to the economists and they said, well, that makes perfect sense. So I thought, okay, this is interesting. This is something we can work with. So with the help of them, I found some economic theory, which fit very well to what we were working with. So basically, there is a whole science dedicated to how groups and companies act in the free markets and within a control structure. That's not really surprising, especially if you work with transfer pricing. That sounds like old hat. But to me, it was a little bit fascinating to see that there was, years and decades of theory behind this. And that was quite useful. So essentially, if you boil it down, it's not really about substance, it's about control. And it's about the level of control a company has within a group and within a market and what can affect that. So looking at it with those classes, it did make very good sense. I'm not saying I purely like the argumentation of the European Court of Justice. And I think what they've basically done is take the argumentation from the Danish Ministry of Taxation. But it does actually make sense. And I think also, again, looking at transfer pricing, it's a good example. When I was at Big Four, we used to tease the transfer pricing department a bit and say, well, you only have to know 2 sections, basically. Which in a way is true, but then you have all the case law and you have basically all the economic theory that you need to apply. And that is not going to get any less. The more influence we have from the OECD, well, the more influence we will have from economic theory. I'm sure of that.
Mm. And doing the research, and you have also different cases in the book. What's your feeling about the current state of play of companies? Is it more like companies trying to find substance to their structures, or there is substance and actually there is maybe tax law interfering to this too much?
I actually think that, the idea of getting out of an potentially abusive tax situation by buying substance. Yeah, sure, there's still a few EU countries where you have some kind of safe harbor rules or something where you can do that. But I think it actually disappeared even before we got the rulings, even before we got the general anti-abuse provisions. So this shift away from buying substance and focusing more on control, I think that has been going on for a long time. And then, of course, the tax authorities have some very nice tools from the rulings and from the new provisions. I think what is left in the development is the taxpayers. I think since 2019, especially, we've been a bit shell-shocked. So our ears are still ringing, and we're not quite confident enough that we can take those rulings and those developments and use them to our own benefits. And I think that's going to be the next step, because now we have a lot of uncertainty. We have a lot of different notions getting mixed up. And what is necessary is that some taxpayers, prioritize that battle and say, okay, we need to draw the line somewhere. We need to push back. And we also need to adjust to defending our tax position in a different way, because we used to focus on all the tax reasons, and now we have to change our game and focus on the non-tax reasons, which is a little bit ironic. But again, going back to my point about being very close to the business you work with, be it as an advisor, being in-house, whatever it is, well, that's become a very, very crucial part of your tax job. And I think that's fine, actually. I think it's good, and I think it's healthy, and I think in the long run, we will see now a tendency that things are going to move in the other direction. So the tax administration will not, in 5 years, just be able to very easily shift the burden of proof, shift the onus to the taxpayer. I think they're gonna get a more hard run for their money. And at least I hope so, because, well, if all multinationals and if all advisors just refrain from doing anything because of fear of the potential tax retributional effects, well, then the rules also have a deterrent effect, and that's not good.
Mm. And finally, on this topic, you've mentioned a couple of times those Danish beneficial ownership cases. Uh, what is your considering everything else happening? There are many other cases throughout Europe, and there is this Shell directive maybe coming or maybe not. But what is the future of holding companies in general? Do you think something materially will change in the traditional holding jurisdictions like Netherlands, Luxembourg, Cyprus, Malta?
I think to a certain extent it will, not because of behavior by the taxpayers, but because in a not too distant future, we will also have to talk about tax competition between the states. Because I think, to be honest, we're reaching a point where we can no longer force any more rules and any more limitations on the taxpayers. And the states are still allowed to compete for revenue. And that's a little bit ironic, especially within the European Union. You're still allowed to not demand a withholding tax at source. Some countries have, generated a lot of foreign investment into their countries by having those rules. And we are, I mean, withholding taxes being an example also of something which is in nature and inherently, well, it's not applied evenly to domestic and foreign corporation. At the moment, yes, it's the only tool a member state has of getting their hands on money from a foreign corporation. But we see a very large increase in measures for cross-border assistance. And there's a lot of arguments to be made that we shouldn't even be able to withhold tax at source within the European Union anymore, because it is discriminatory in nature. If we move down that direction, and there have been some some first steps at least, well, then we also have to talk about, are states allowed to compete between each other? To a certain extent, they're not, because then it's state aid. But what we also really need to look at is, if we do these, well, not harmonizations perhaps, but at least streamlinings of the rule, well, why are you still allowed to have selectivity on something so key as a withholding tax, for example? So I think that is going to be one of the new developments we'll see. Maybe not just in the European Union, but at some point also globally. Because if you look at where foreign investment is directed, well, that of course also depends on the conditions in the double tax treaties. So it's a market and a sub-market, but yeah, the idea is basically the same. If you want to eliminate tax competition, you also have to create a level playing field.
Mm-hmm. And but continuing on this withholding tax issue, do you see there has been some other fraud in Denmark regarding withholding tax, where all the tax world
Yes.
was watching what will happen with that? Do you see technically this faster directive resolving the issues, or it's probably will?
No, I actually don't. And to be brutally honest with you, those cases in Denmark, sure, there is a sign that the rules for withholding taxes are a little bit outdated, and the system is a bit outdated because the system is not really geared for an economy which is so global and so mobile as the one we have now. But what is really a symptom of is the consequence you get when you cut back too heavily on your tax control resources in a country. Because those cases in Denmark, well, they're a very clear example that if you don't have sufficient resources in the tax agency to control everything, some of those cases, well, you can blame the employees, but in theory, what they would, I think the worst examples they found were people who would, in theory, have to look at 300 cases during a workday and control 300 cases in a workday. That's not possible. So that's not the fault of the employees. I think in general, I know I'm biased because I used to work at the ministry, but I would say tax professionals working for the state in Denmark are really, really good at their job in general. They're excellent people. They make an effort. And it's not their fault. But if you're severely understaffed, no, of course you don't have an efficient control. So I think in a way, if we should change something in that regard, really efficient, then we should make it mandatory that when you have new and complex tax legislation enforced, well, then you also need to upgrade the number of resources allocated to controlling them. And I think that's pretty heartbreaking to see that if you look at let's take Pillar 2 as an example. Most of the EU countries now have some kind of also domestic proposal. And when you look at no matter where you are, they always describe what will be the cost of implementing these rules. And none of them really describe a large increase in cost for extra personnel to handle this. It just falls on the existing employees. And to me, that is absolutely crazy. If you ask any big advisory firm, hey, are you upgrading? Are you hiring people with a specific knowledge of this? I'm sure they'll say yes. And if not, they're training existing people and hiring in, everybody is reinforcing, but not the tax authorities. And then what's the point of introducing new rules if you're not going to give them a chance to actually reinforce it and actually do a proper job? Because if they don't have the time to do a proper job, well, we all lose. So
we are approaching end of the hour. Do you mind if we run over a little bit, or you're tight with schedule?
no, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay. Then continuing a little bit on this pillar 2, of course, I wanted to ask, considering your profile, that what's your take on these all the big scandals in the news, Paradise Paper, Panama, what else there was? This will Pillar 2 change the state of play regarding, and is that just the tip of the iceberg?
I have to be honest and say I don't think Pillar 2 is such in itself is going to dramatically change anything. Yes, it's going to increase the number of advisory fee. That's it. I don't see, to me, you have a very, very complex set of rules, which in themselves are creating a very artificial environment. In a way, they're similar to transfer pricing rules in that sense, because, well, what you do, you try to measure an illusion, basically. I think this is also an illusion. You can tell very large multinational groups and taxpayers in general that, yes, you have to pay a certain percentage of tax in all of the countries, and you have to distribute it like this. Does that mean they're ever going to be able to do that in practice? No, it does not. Of course not. And I think one thing that Pillar 2 really underestimates is the fact that yes, taxes play a role in where business is conducted and where value is created, but it is just one factor. And a lot of different things are at play. I mean, if you're a huge production facility, you can have all kinds of ambitions to move your entire production to a different part of the world. Does that mean you have enough engineers or doctors or whatever it is you need in that part of the world? No, of course it doesn't. So, I mean, the more old school the business is, well, the more fixed they also are in a way. And I think ironically, Pillar 2, well, it's going to be very difficult for the proposal to affect those businesses. I don't see it happening in practice. One of our peers described it very excellently and said, yes, you can tell me to jump out of the plane and flap my wings, but that doesn't mean I'm going to fly. And I think that's very telling of Pillar 2. Yes, you can write the rules, you can enforce them in all the countries and all the taxpayers, but I want to see the revenue effects before I believe them.
Yeah. And it all boils down to some anxiety, some mental health issues regarding everything what is happening right now in the world. Let's take the latest news about the Apple case, where
Yeah.
basically the final decision hopefully will be next year at the European courts, but now we see that it's again a new wave of discussions about is it state aid that Apple has been effectively paying 1% effective corporate tax rate, and look at Italy, which is now considering if data supply by Facebook has been supply for which VAT has had to be charged. So. I cannot imagine how companies and tax professionals within the companies can cope with all those risks. It's a nightmare.
It is a nightmare, and you are expected to have a crystal ball and to be able
Yeah.
to foresee the future. No one is. I think one thing that's really important to remember about taxes is that you have an advantage until it's taken away from you. And that's true about everything. It's true about the general rules and the specific rules, and you you have to not plan too far ahead because you don't know what the future will hold.
Yeah. But then the final question is there a sort of some solution how to fix this all? Because I think nobody knows.
Nobody knows. Is there a solution? I
What would
think
be ideal tax system? Let's say what would you do if you were like Minister of Finance of Denmark?
I would bring it more up to speed with what the world actually looks like, and I know that is what we're trying to do with Pillar 2. But I would, and that's not just because I'm working on the taxpayer side now, but I would look more closely at how to minimize tax competition between the countries. And I would actually start there and say, now we have enough rules and we have enough tools for the tax authorities. How do we make sure that they have the skills and the means to use them? And how do we make sure that the states don't cannibalize each other, especially within the internal market of the European Union? Because then we would have a much more level playing field. And you can make the same arguments at the OECD level. Yes, we have international overhauls, we have Pillar 2, we have very nice ambitions with the inclusive framework, and I fully agree. The more countries that participate, the better. But then we also need to have a very real and candid conversation about, well, are these systems that we're setting up, are these overhauls we're doing, are they actually benefiting everybody, or are they benefiting the D20, basically? And I think until we have that debate, I don't really think we have any business of making these massive overhauls and imposing all of these constraints on the taxpayers, because we don't fully know what we're doing.
Right. Susie, it's been pleasure, but final question is actually the same as to every of my guests. What would be your version of meaning of life in general? So I'm very excited to hear your answer, especially considering your background you told about.
Well, considering my background and considering somebody who has not just seen but also had a career where you work with the very worst aspects of humans. You do that when you work with war. You realize what we're all capable of when push comes to shove, and you realize that you shouldn't take anything for granted. So, despite all of that, I still I still believe in the good in people. I still believe that, well, whatever it is you're fighting for is worth the battle. As long as you still enjoy a beautiful sunset and a beautiful sunrise, then yeah, keep going.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
You too.
And dear listeners, don't forget Susi Baerentzen, The Effectiveness of General Anti-Avoidance Rules. You can buy it at IBFD, so and everywhere else. So I suggest you read and thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Anis. It was a pleasure.